Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iconic Comics review. I'm going to do this a little bit differently in a couple of different ways. First of all, I'm reviewing the PDF of this book. So most of what you're going to see are just screenshots from the book, taken from here and there. Not a whole lot. I'm not looking to tell you the whole story, of course. But I think this is a better way to give you an idea of things I'm talking about as I discuss the story, rather than just holding a page up to the camera. Normally, I would wait until I have a book in hand for a couple of reasons. First of all, most campaigns don't give you a PDF with your physical book. Usually you can just get a book. There isn't a PDF available for a bunch of reasons. I think the biggest one is a concern about piracy, which I think is not as big an issue as people make it out to be. But I'm really not here to talk about that. Whether you get one or not, I understand. It's just a decision people have to make about how they want to control their IPs and what kind of products they want to produce. I usually wait to talk about a campaign until I have the physical book, because the physical book is something I generally review. But Iconic comic books have been consistently very high quality, with a good paper stock and a good binding. I own almost 20 of these books. They are all very good. At this point, I feel it's kind of pedantic to wait until I hold the actual physical book to tell you what the quality is probably going to be. Now, I will release comments if I get the actual book and it's not as good as their previous books have been. But they've got a 6-year track record at this point. I don't have any expectations that things are going to change. Now, the second thing to address is the fact that this review is going to contain spoilers for Kamen America Volume 8. And if you haven't read that and you would like to read this series at all, go and read that first before you watch this. Honestly, you should probably be looking to jump onto the series with volumes 1 through 4 or volumes 5 through 8. Those both have pretty good jumping on points if you're new to the franchise, and this book, to get a little bit ahead of myself, really isn't a good point to join the franchise. I mean, you can, but you're going to be missing a lot of context, so I wouldn't recommend it. And again, I would try not to spoil a major plot point from a previous book, but in order to understand a lot of the character dynamics we're going to be discussing here, I have to. All right? Okay. So, for my usual review format, the physical book is probably going to be pretty great. It's at the Iconic Comics quality, and that is good. It's hardbound, it has good paper stock. I expect them to continue to deliver this, and if they don't, I mean, I'm not walking away from the series, but it would be kind of disappointing. The art in this book is once again by Timothy Lim. He is the sole artist on this book, and he does a really good job. I also got the Kamen Ramen side story, which is illustrated by Hachihusa, or 8husa, but I believe it's Hachihusa because he or she is a Japanese artist, and that's how you pronounce 8 in Japan. Both of these artists are really good. They have a great command of a somewhat comedic and very cute, appealing style that still lends itself to very dynamic action scenes when you want to include them. Now, I'm not really familiar with Hachihusa's art style outside of the fan work he's done for Kamen America and some of the covers. He could be deliberately aping Tim Lim's style in his paneling for this series, or this could just be the way he draws all of his manga panels. I don't know. That said, his artwork here feels very organic to the Kamen America world. In my review for Black Ops 6, I mentioned that the wide gap in the realism and the use of hatching and shading and things like that between Lim and Matthew Weldon, who did the other part of the book, these two things felt very jarring, and it kind of interrupted the narrative a bit as I was reading it. That problem doesn't exist if you go directly from Kamen Ramen to Kamen America. Hachihusa still has a very distinct style. It's different from Timothy Lim's art, but it feels so aesthetically similar that it's not jarring to go from one to another. Story-wise, Kamen Ramen tells us the backstory of the walking ramen cup robot she shows up with in Volume 8. It's a nice, touching bit of backstory that kind of fleshes out the character and lets us get to know Marmot Maiden a little bit more, which is an important inclusion given that she and Ice Tosterone feel like they're going to be more and more reservists in the Kamen camp as the story goes on. The story of Kamen America Volume 9 picks up in the aftermath of the Hoover Dam incident and the death of Charles Vanders. We actually begin with a flashback that focuses on Zener Techno, Much as the first two sagas in Kamen America all opened on flashbacks to Carly and her father, this saga is opening on a flashback to Zener Techno, Morito Nano, and her mother, Hiromi. This also introduces the moral through line of this story, just like those previous flashback sequences did. We hear Hiromi tell her daughter that sometimes the ends justify the means. That's a far cry from the kinds of moral lessons that Charles Vanders would impart on his daughter. There's a lot of really rich interplay just in that handful of pages. Nano-chan is developing into a sort of morally inverted version of Carly. From the sounds of things, she's gotten a bunch of really questionable moral lessons from her mother, and now she's beginning to doubt the faction she's thrown herself in with. As the architect of much of the technology that seems to keep them going, that means we could be seeing a rift opening inside the ranks of the Zeners. That's very clever stuff. And everyone likes a Green Ranger story arc, even though we kind of already had that with Vicky. Zener Techno is actually the only Zener Ranger we see in the story arc as well. Most of the Zeners are kind of out of action. A bunch of them got the tar beaten out of them at the Hoover Dam, so they're probably not going to show up again very soon. But Nano had the strongest connection to the Common Core already, because of her connection to Carly through her father. So this makes the continuity of the series very strong, even though most of the enemies that the Common Core fights in this story are not the automatons, which it turns out Nano really did most of the building for, but rather Mad Shadow, a kind of street gang that is at least inspired by the actions of Sylvia and the Zeners in the previous story arc. So all in all, I would say that this story has very, very good, strong continuity with the previous story. That's one of the things that actually makes it a poor jumping on point if you're new to the series. If you don't have a lot of context of the conflicts over volumes 7 and 8, you're going to miss many of the interpersonal character elements that take place here, and a lot of the plot elements are going to be at least a little bit murky to you. Things like the dark suits and fight the light, and a lot of the slogans that Sylvia and the Zeners have been throwing around aren't really re-explained in this volume, which I think is fine. I think it's fine to have, very strong continuity like this. Not every volume needs to be a jumping on point, and while I would expect the beginning of a new story arc to be a jumping on point, not every jumping on point needs to be as accessible as others. Still, I would recommend Omnibuses 1 or 2 over Volume 9 if you're looking to get into the series. In terms of writing and characterization, this volume is an interesting bit. I would say that Saga 2 in Kamen America was a little bit darker than Saga 1 was. It was still pretty lighthearted, but we had a lot of heavy things in it. We saw two very important father figures to the Common Core die in that series, Sylvia's dad and Carly's. However, Kamen America is from a fairly lighthearted genre. Super Sentai is not really known for having a ton of heavy elements to it. So, in this volume, we return to a more lighthearted tone, which is very welcome to see. It's not fun to have dour, serious consequences in every book in a story. That said, they are not afraid to have some of that darkness from the last series carry over into this one. There's a lot of interpersonal conflicts going on in this book that are a little bit below the surface, at least until the end. There's a lot of tension between Carly and Sylvia. Sylvia believes her mother is still someone who's on her side. Carly, understandably, believes that is no longer the case, and she's still really hurting from her father's death. Who can blame her? To balance a lot of that out, the shenanigans in this book are maybe a little more over the top than in previous books. Sylvia has been coming out more and more as a gamer over the history of the series, and in this one she's upgraded a lot of the tech in her suit to have kind of a video game skin to it, and there are a lot of fun gags that revolve around that. In particular, laying out the Nyanfield amusement park they're at as if it was a video game beat-em-up level is a fun sight gag. All in all, I think this story does a good job setting up the next arc for Kamen America. We see the conflict building with the Zeners, we have an idea of what the Zeners' weaknesses are now, but we also see Sylvia is running a scheme of her own, and she plans to put things into action soon. The Common Core has its own problems to work out, not least of all those interpersonal matters that are creeping around the edges for most of the story and eventually break out into full view in the denouement, but they also have to deal with their old enemy, the media, which is in the pockets of Sylvia, at least for the moment, while she still has money in her pockets. Once again, Mark Pellegrini is in the process of setting up a lot of interesting elements, and I expect that he and Tim Lim will have a great time knocking them down when it comes time. In short, I think this story has all of the elements I would expect from the first volume in a new story arc. It reintroduces all the characters, it sets up an interesting situation and interesting characters with a lot of tension and conflict potential between them. It also drops in a couple of new characters for the waifu wars. We get Sierra and Nano herself, an important element in a cute girl-centric series like this. In short, if you already like the Kamen America formula, there's plenty here that builds on it. But there's also a little bit of innovation to keep things fresh, which is always nice to see. My only real complaint here is that Vicky, Kamen Terra, comes back into the story for the first 5-8 pages, and then she's gone again. This is partly because the Kamen Corps does another overseas trip, and the conditions of Vicky's parole don't seem to let her leave the country yet. But I would really like to see her back in the story for good. I really feel like, even though she's had more screen time in the Black Ops franchise than the rest of the Kamen Corps, she still feels a little underdeveloped compared to the rest of them. But other than that, I have no complaints. It is a very solid installment into a series that continues to be very entertaining reading. If you already know you like the series, pick this up. It's well worth your money. If you don't know whether you like the Kamen America franchise yet, I'd recommend picking up the second omnibus. I really feel that has the highest highs of the series, and if you like it, you'll be ready to go straight into Volume 9, where things really hit the fan. But as always, those are my thoughts on the story. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.